Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. This is actually a special Saturday episode, and I want to talk about this article that came out regarding the Santorini caldera volcano, or the eruption of Thera. Now, if you haven't heard of this, I'm sure you guys have all heard of the Pompeii or Vesuvius volcanic eruption, with the famous images of people still in their living rooms and holding each other while covered with all this dust. Well, the Santorini caldera actually predates that. I think it's about 3400 BC. No, 16th century BC, so 3400 years ago. Excuse me. And this story is not just about the volcano. It's also about radiocarbon dating in general. A lot of people have disputed radiocarbon dates, saying that they're not completely accurate, that it can only give you a time frame with the range of about 14,000 years before this thing called radiocarbon 14. It has a lifespan, and that lifespan is about 14,000 years at most. So a lot of people dispute the actual accuracy. So sometimes you'll hear a date. Oh, we radiocarbon dated this peanut to between 400 and 800 years old. Like, there's always some sort of big range because of the way that they calibrate the radiocarbon dating. But this article kind of uses a different approach to it's still radiocarbon dating, but it's a tweaked approach to get a more precise date. So this article explores the dates of this eruption, because it's not written about in any Greek or any type of Mediterranean, or any civilization hasn't really talked specifically about this volcano. And before I get into that, you can kind of see this is the actual Santorini island, and the volcano itself is a little bit north of Nea Kameni, or New Kameni. And as you can see, it looks like a huge chunk of this was just blown out of the ocean, that is just so insane. I couldn't imagine living through this. So this article, anyway, back to the article, it explores the dates, the archaeological dating and the radiocarbon dating. So let's get into this. The title of the article, Dating the Ancient Minoan Eruption of Thera Using Tree Rings. They want to get the date down really specific. So the numbers I'm about to read off, it kind of seemed, because my first impression was whatever, it's not that different, but it actually makes a big difference. And they want radiocarbon dating to be really as precise as possible. They want to kind of, and when I say they, I mean the scientists that use radiocarbon dating, which is generally accepted by by scholars and scientists. But the main criticism of it is, like I said before, it's too broad. The long-standing debate about when the volcano Thera erupted by resolving discrepancies between archaeological and radiocarbon methods of dating the eruption. It's about tying together a timeline of ancient Egypt, Greece, Turkey, and the rest of the Mediterranean at this crucial point in the ancient world. When this volcano erupted, it wasn't just the Mediterranean wasn't the only thing that was affected, although it was largely affected. It took the brunt of it. But places as far off as China, even parts of Western Europe and Egypt, Turkey, obviously, they all stood to be affected by this huge eruption. And all their records, they don't really directly mention it, although they do sort of refer to it in a sense. But they don't say that specifically a volcano erupted here at this time. There's no record of that. Charlotte Pearson is the name of the lead scientist who's spearheading the new calibration technique of radiocarbon dating. So whenever you see Pearson, or if I'm saying a quote, it's going to be from her. What we can say now is that radiocarbon evidence is compatible with the archaeological evidence for an eruption of Thera in the 16th century BC. That's good. Thera's explosive eruption on Santorini more than 3,400 years ago buried the Minoan settlement on the island in a layer of ash and pumice more than 130 feet deep. Woo! Yeah, that must have been a huge explosion. 130 feet. That's buildings. That's like a skyscraper of ash and pumice. Woo. Anyway, the effects of the eruption were felt as far away as Egypt and what is now Istanbul in Turkey. If you can date precisely when that moment is, then whenever you find evidence of that moment at any archaeological site, you suddenly have a very precise marker point in time. Okay, this is why it's so important to pin down the actual date, because, like she said, it's like a snapshot in history. If you could precisely date this eruption, then everything else in that time frame, that Minoan time frame, you can reference back to this volcano. So it's like if you're in like a desert island, or if you're in like a desert with like in a sandstorm and everything's obscured and you're not sure where anything is. This is like planting a huge flag in the middle of the desert, something that you can refer back to with certainty. So that's why this is very important. So let's look at the archaeological evidence first. Archaeologists have estimated the eruption as occurring sometime between 1570 and 1500 BC. So they have like a span of 70 years where this could have happened. And they did this by analyzing artifacts, written records from Egypt, and pottery from digs. Other researchers estimated the date of the eruption about 1600 BC using the old radiocarbon method. 1600 BC is out of that range. It's 30 years after the archaeological. So they want to reconcile this discrepancy by really getting to the bottom of this. And then they did that from bits of trees, grains, and legumes found right below the layer of the ash. So if you have 130 feet of ash, you want to look at the sediment layer right underneath it prior to the ash being there, and you want to analyze the organic material under it to get because if you know how old the stuff underneath it is, then you can kind of ballpark when the eruption happened. By using radiocarbon measurements from the annual rings of trees that lived at the time of the eruption, the University of Arizona led team dates the eruption to someplace between 1600 and 1525. So they came up with a ballpark range that's more close to the archaeological evidence, which overlaps with the 1570 to the 1500 date range. So let's talk about the current radiocarbon calibration curve. So over the past 50 years, scientists have been trying to perfect this radiocarbon dating thing, and in this case, they use tree rings that extend 14,000 years into the past. At that time, the scientists needed to use chunks of wood that combined 10 to 20 years of a tree's annual rings to have enough wood to test for radiocarbon. So if you know anything about tree rings, each ring is generally like a year. So they take 10 to 20 years worth of a tree's rings. So it's pretty thick. It's a pretty substantial amount to have enough wood to test for radiocarbon. But now they require just a few slivers of wood to radiocarbon test. They don't need a huge chunk anymore. So Pearson and her colleagues, they tested the annual growth of the tree rings from 1500 back to 1700 BC. So they took a 200-year range. They took a sample of tree rings that dated to those dates, and then they tested that. It was the reason why they took something so broad. They took a date so broad is because they wanted to know before, during, and after the event and compare all the rings and see if there's any discrepancy. So she's essentially redoing the calibration curve at an annual scale, year by year. So it's really, really meticulous and precise, and it must take a lot of work to do this. So I don't want to understate the importance of this eruption, because the Minoan era is really it's like the Dark Ages for Mediterranean history. Like they don't know exactly what happened. They have an idea of what was going on, but like the article says, there have been whole conferences dedicated to when the eruption occurred. So this is a really huge thing that's going on, that's being reconciled within the scientific community. So every tree ring is a time capsule of the radiocarbon at the year in which it grew. So we can say here's a tree ring from 1600 BC, and here's how much radiocarbon is in it. So think of it as like a little time capsule, but it's organic and it's alive, and you can extract data from it. Like I said earlier, carbon-14 decays at a steady rate, and it's kind of like a clock that counts backwards. It counts down backwards, and it indicates when the tree grew that ring, basically. Here's what they actually did, and this is really interesting. So they took 2 different tree ring chronologies from long-lived trees that were alive at the time of the Thera eruption, but were growing 7,000 miles apart. So these trees weren't even anywhere near the explosion, but they lived during the time. And remember, an explosion as this big has global implications. It's not just its own region. Although that region, the Mediterranean in this case, was hit the hardest. On the other, all that smoke, all that stuff, all the ejector that comes out, it goes into the atmosphere and it spreads like think of a mushroom cloud, but way bigger. And then it covers the sky, and that's gonna affect the other side of the globe. So here she took bristlecone pines living in California and Nevada, like southwest United States, and she took that 200 tree ring samples representing each year to the 200-year span between 1700 to 1500 BC, and then Brown, the other researcher, provided 85 Irish oak annual tree ring samples that spanned the same years. So they have a lot of material that they're working with here. Because Irish oaks and bristlecone pines add a growth ring every year, the rings laid down year by year represent an environmental history going back thousands of years of time. So these trees are cold climate trees. The exceptionally cold year shows up as a much narrower tree ring. So for cold climate trees such as Irish oaks and bristlecones, they're cold climate trees. So when it's an exceptionally cold year, the tree ring is much narrower. It's obvious when you look at it. So if you were to look at the tree rings, and I'll show you a picture in a second, the narrow ones, you could kind of say, oh, this is a pretty, this must have been a cold year. It's kind of like the Greenland ice cores. So Salzer's work reveals at least 4 different years within the new radiocarbon age range for Thera, where the bristlecone pines had exceptionally narrow rings that might indicate a huge volcanic eruption. So there's 4 different years where the rings were super narrow. That's kind of suggests the eruption happened, and for 4 years, at the minimum 4 years, was a crazy amount of cold. That could cause famine. That could definitely that could bring down an entire civilization, which might have happened with the Minoans, right? We don't know what happened to them exactly, although a lot of people have speculations, and there are hints here and there all throughout the archaeological record that they did disappear, probably because of this. And they probably weren't the first civilization to disappear because of this, or because of something like this, rather. So Pearson says they're using the annual nature of the tree rings to improve the existing calibration curve for radiocarbon. This research is about Thera, but really the implications of it are profound for anyone that uses radiocarbon dating throughout the world for this time span. There's a revolution in the radiocarbon community to revise the calibration curve using these more precise measurements. So there's 2 stories going on here. One is the actual Thera volcano and when it actually happened, which they kind of narrowed it down probably like 1550 or something like that, BC. But the overarching story, the second story rather, that will probably be way more pervasive into other areas of study, are using the tree rings and the new calibration method. Other research teams are also finding discrepancies between their radiocarbon measurements using annual tree rings and the current radiocarbon calibration curve. So other teams are going to take a cue from this, and it's only going to benefit everybody else. It's only going to benefit the entire community. And this is why I love stories like this, because not only are, I'm sure every researcher has their own personal motivations to either be the first one to discover something or to change the paradigm. I'm sure a lot of researchers have those aspirations, but also it's very refreshing to hear that there are researchers out there who are just trying to improve the methods and techniques for everybody, so we can all get closer to the truth. And this is why I like this story so much. So let's look at a few photos. So this is a town that was damaged by earthquakes called Akrotiri, and this is what it looks like now. I mean, when it happened, it's probably even worse. But this is some of the stuff that they found under the ash. Here are the tree rings, the dated tree rings. So you can see some are definitely a lot thicker than others. Some of them are like not even You can barely even make them out, some of them. But they radiocarbon dated 200 of these rings, and they found out that 4 of them were oddly thin. So this is from a low altitude oak tree, and there's also the high altitude bristlecone pine, and they compared them with the internationally agreed radiocarbon calibration curve. So yeah, it's like an agreement. And this is Charlotte herself at her lab, the University of Arizona Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. Awesome. This place is a national treasure, and I'm glad that there are people like her trying to improve technology, techniques, methods, and the whole scientific community takes a cue from her, and I think that's awesome. Any questions? What do you guys think about this story? Is it a good story? Is it interesting? Did you guys even know anything about radiocarbon dating before this? It's a really complex subject. I mean, even I have trouble understanding it, and which isn't saying much. I'm not like some genius or anything, but it's nice to hear that someone's trying to do something about the actual criticism of radiocarbon dating, because a lot of people do accept it, but there are other researchers who just, they don't even accept any dates from any radiocarbon dating. So when there are issues like that, then it's really hard to get to the truth or get to the bottom of anything. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'll send the links in the article. I mean, I'll put the links in the description below. And I'll see you guys on Monday.